right. Do you want to tell me when you've hit the record button?
Oh, it's recording. You can go.
Oh, okay, great. Okay. My name is Laura Powell. I serve as the Islam Ministry Specialist for Women in Apologetics. And Jane asked me to share a little bit about my background. So I was not raised in a Christian home. I heard the gospel for the first time when I was 21 years old and a senior at Duke University. I committed my life to Christ at that time, and I never had any desire to leave the US. I certainly didn't want to be anything like a missionary, but what has happened is I've had many opportunities to travel and minister to Muslims and to Westerners working in Muslim nations internationally. And I kind of saw each opportunity as just an isolated experience. But after many isolated experiences ministering to Muslims, it was starting to become clear that I had the knowledge and experience to, and the heart that I gained over time, compassion, especially for women in Muslim nations, but for the lost generally, and those caught up in the darkness and the hopelessness and the fear of Islam, to minister to them, to share truth. So a few of the really formative experiences I've had are some time in Afghanistan in 2009 and 2010. I trained and launched a team of engineers and architects and their families to the Middle East with an organization called Engineering Ministries International. I served in Lesbos, Greece during the height of the refugee crisis there, when Muslims were fleeing Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and passing through Turkey, over the Aegean Sea, and into Greece. And after that experience, I decided to commit to ministering to Muslims in the refugee community that was about 20 miles from my house in Atlanta. And there was one family in particular, a family of 9, so 7 children, who I became really close to. I tutored them every day after their formal schooling for about 6 hours, taught them how to read, taught them English, math, history, a little bit of science, American culture. And we had lots of spiritual conversations that were excellent. We also talked a bit about economics and policy. My major at Duke was public policy, and so that's a passion of mine. And in my experience, Muslims love to talk about 2 things more than anything else: religion and politics. So those are two topics that I absolutely love to talk about. But in the US, they're kind of taboo. So I had so much fun sitting with my Muslim friends over snacks and food and dinner for hours upon hours, debating policy and Islam versus Christianity and things like that. So and then my husband and I moved to a rural town in North Carolina where there were not any Muslims who I know of. And so I started just blogging about topics related to apologetics and generally, as well as Islam specifically. And that turned into an opportunity to join Women in Apologetics. So I am absolutely loving that. If you've never heard of Women in Apologetics, check us out, womeninapologetics.com. And as I was mentioning before we started here, we have our first ever online video course that's being released on June 7th. Registration is open right now, and the topic is Islam foundations. So we're going to talk about the most common objections Muslims raise to Christianity, how to defend our Christian beliefs using evidence and reason, and how to make a case against Islam, as well as understanding Islamic cultures to some degree, understanding major differences and similarities between Islam and Christianity, learning about the life and teachings of Muhammad, and a lot more. So if I'm just going to go over 6 Muslim objections to Christianity tonight. I'll have about 8 minutes or so on each objection. So if you want to delve deeper into these topics, I would encourage you to check out the Islam Foundations course. I think it's been really well done. We've had a team of professionals putting it together, and we're very excited about it. So I'm going to get started. I'll just jump right in. So by far, the most common objection to Christianity that Muslims have raised to me is that the Christian scriptures have been corrupted. Okay, they've been changed, they've been corrupted. We can't really even know what they originally taught, except by looking at the Quran, of course, to gain some insight. But anytime the Christian scriptures contradict the Quran, Muslims will say that the Christian scriptures have been corrupted. And the standard responses to this claim that Christians usually respond with are things like, well, we have over 5,000 Greek manuscripts with remarkable consistency that were found all over the ancient world from as early as the 2nd century. Christians will often also say, we'll look at archaeology. The archaeological evidence shows the Gospels are very historical. They're attentive to detail. They are remarkably accurate. And so if they are this reliable and accurate in so many details that we can know, then it seems that we should be able to trust the Gospels more generally as well. A lot of times Christians will point to the embarrassing details in the Gospels, which really indicate that these were not just made up to push forth some made up agenda or religion. We've got difficult teachings from Jesus. We've got a bunch of disciples who look like utter fools. We have women discovering the empty tomb. Women couldn't even testify in court. They were not considered reliable. There are a whole bunch more embarrassing details that would not have been included if this was just a made up book. Christians will also rightfully point to the growth of the church right there in Jerusalem where the events took place. This is significant because there were witnesses all over the place. The Apostle Paul said there were over 500 witnesses to the resurrection at one time. Jerusalem, was not a town of many, many millions of people. You just go ask people who live there, who were the witnesses? What did you see? What did you hear? What happened? And of course, they could have just produced a body and Christianity would have been squelched immediately. We can also point to the internal consistency within the Bible. We have people like J. Warner Wallace, who was a cold case detective for decades, saying these Gospels read exactly like true eyewitness accounts. This is exactly what we would expect to find from actual reliable eyewitnesses. So there are a lot of standard Christian responses that are all excellent. I strongly encourage everybody to know these and to review these often. And if you want to learn more about this, one book I recommend is Can We Still Believe the Bible by Craig Blomberg. He's phenomenal. Anything he's written is excellent. Some of it is extremely academic and scholarly. Some of it's a little more accessible to lay people, but everything he writes is excellent. But I want to propose this evening an alternative response when speaking to Muslims in particular. This response I've found to be far more effective, easily understood by Muslims, and quicker and easier to explain as well. So the foundation of this argument is that the Quran actually affirms the inspiration, authority, and preservation of the Gospels. That's absolutely critical for every Christian to know. If you know a Christian who does not know this, tell them. The Quran actually affirms the inspiration, authority, and preservation of the Gospels. We as Christians don't even affirm the perfect preservation of the Gospels. We'll say, well, we have, over 5,000 Greek manuscripts. We have over 20,000 manuscripts, ancient manuscripts from all different languages. But so you look and you see all this consistency. The changes within the manuscripts are so minor, they don't affect any major doctrine, things like that. But we don't say that the Gospels have always in every manuscript been 100% accurately preserved. Yet the Quran does claim that God's words cannot ever be changed after having taught that the Gospels are the word of God, that they were sent down from God, they're authoritative. Everybody who has access to them is to obey them, to judge according to them, to stand firm upon them, to trust them as the word of God. And then it says that the words of God cannot be changed. So this is critical for Christians to know, for everybody to know. I have some verses here that I don't have time to go over, but these are Quran verses. You can see the affirmation of divine inspiration of the Gospels in Quran 3:3-4, and 547. Affirmation of the ongoing authority of the Gospels in 547 and 568. And by the way, I'll go ahead and mention now, as you can see here in my notes, another important line of reasoning to keep in mind is that if the Gospels were reliable in the 7th century when Muhammad was alive and teaching that they were reliable, and when the Quran was revealed, then they're certainly reliable now, because our Gospels are based on manuscripts that predate the 7th century. Okay, so if the Gospels were reliable in the 7th century, they're definitely reliable in the 21st century because they're based on manuscripts from the 3rd and 4th century. And then we see perfect preservation of the Gospels in Quran 6:115 and 18:27, among other passages. But here's the next part of this argument. But the Quran contradicts the Gospels on key issues. 3 issues where the Quran contradicts the Gospels that I go into great detail in the Islam Foundations course are the deity of Jesus. The Quran says Jesus was not deity and he never claimed to be. The death of Jesus. The Quran says that Jesus was not killed or crucified, which is a big, big problem for Islam, because this is considered by most scholars to be the most certain fact in all of ancient history, that Jesus was without a doubt crucified under Pontius Pilate and killed. But the Quran says he wasn't. The Quran says that Allah just made it look like Jesus was crucified, but it was really somebody else. And then the Quran does not allow for the resurrection of Jesus because it says he wasn't even killed. Muslims believe that Jesus was taken directly to heaven. He never died. He was never killed. He was never crucified, just taken directly to heaven. And so this right here is the essence of the gospel. So we have the Quran affirming the inspiration, authority, and preservation of the Gospels, but then contradicting the Gospels on the most central critical issues. So here's the Islamic dilemma. If the Gospels are trustworthy, then the Quran is not trustworthy because the Quran contradicts the Gospels on key issues. But if the Gospels are not trustworthy, then the Quran is also not trustworthy because the Quran says the Gospels are trustworthy. So either way, the Quran is false. And Islam really stands or falls on the reliability of the Quran, just as Christianity stands or falls on the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Okay, so that right there is the Islamic dilemma. This is the key line of reasoning argument that I say all Christians need to know. If I'm given 30 minutes to teach on just one topic, that is usually what I will choose, because it not only defends against the most common objection to Christianity made by Muslims, but it also calls into question the reliability of the Quran and leaves Muslims in a very, very difficult place. That argument will work for just about any objection that Muslims have to the Gospels and their message. So objection number 2, I also hear a lot from Muslims, that God is not a father in any sense of the word. He has no son in any sense of the word. The reason I emphasize in any sense of the word is because I was taught 15 years ago when I first started ministering to Muslims that the only problem Muslims have with the idea of God being a father or like a father is that they object to the idea that God would have had sex with Mary in order to produce Jesus. And so I was taught, if you just explain that to them, that we don't believe God had sex with Mary, then they won't have an issue anymore with God as a father. But in my experience, even once that is cleared up, there is this huge objection and reaction of angst and disagreement, harsh disagreement at referring to God as even being like a father. They will agree that God is like all kinds of things that even Muslims have told me. I'll say, well, the Bible also says that he's like a door who he protects his sheep from the outside wolves like a door. I was referring to an analogy given in John, and they're like, yeah, he's like a door. And I said, and he's also like a father. And they're like, no, he's not like a father. I'm like, you agree he's like a door? You don't agree he's like a father? And that is what I've discovered, that there is this huge issue with God being like a father in any sense of the word, and that and of him having children, whether spiritual children adopted into his family or otherwise. So the reason they object to this is the Quran. The Quran says God is not a father, he has no son. The Quran says people are God's slaves, and he is their slave master. So that's a better analogy according to the Quran. He's not like a father with who has a son and who adopts children into his family. He is like a slave master who doesn't like his disobedient slaves, but approves of his obedient slaves. And then in Quran 33, 4 and 5, the Quran actually nullifies adoption. There's a long story behind that involving Muhammad and a woman he lusted after. But the Quran says essentially, do not consider your adopted sons to be your sons. They're not your sons. Don't give them your last name. Give them the last name of their biological father, because that's who they really belong to. So even adoption in any sense is an idea, concept that's objectionable to a lot of Muslims. So as far as how to respond, I don't spend a whole lot of time arguing this. You could use the Islamic dilemma, but really I see this as an opportunity to get Muslims to think about what they believe and why they believe it, because I find a lot of them don't even know why they object so much to the idea of God as a father. And so I might ask, I do clarify, you do understand we don't believe God had sex to create a son, right? And once that's cleared up though, I'll generally ask something like, so what is it about the idea of God being portrayed as a loving father that you object to? It's always interesting to see how Muslims respond. Usually the answer is it's just not right, or the Quran says that it's just not true, or he's nothing like a father that's so earthly or worldly. He's far above being even compared to a father. So something I might say, just to give some thoughts as you consider conversations with Muslims, I might say, so we have a loving father who loves us like his own children and wants a personal relationship with us. You have a slave master who cannot be known and finds it offensive to adopt us into his spiritual family and love us as his own children. Which one seems better to you? And a lot of times I just like to ask my Muslim friends, just think about it later tonight. Think about it on your own time. I don't want you to necessarily answer right now. And I find that they really do think about this when they're alone. In the moment, they tend to feel a need, as I think all of us do, to defend what we believe without really thinking about what the other person is promoting or believing or arguing for. But it's often when people are alone with their thoughts that they do start to think about things like this. And I think it's really hands down preferable to have a loving God who loves us as his own children, who he wants the very best for, rather than a slave master who doesn't love us as soon as we're disobedient. The third most common objection, or a third common objection Muslims raise to me, is that Jesus was not God and he did not claim to be God. This objection also comes from the Quran. Chapter 5, verse 116, and chapter 5, verse 72 are two primary examples of that. And again, with this, I would respond with telling my Muslim friends that the Quran affirms the Gospels, and the Gospels repeatedly show Jesus claiming to be deity. You can also use the Islamic dilemma. One issue, though, that I found with this is that not only Muslims, but including Muslims, but also Buddhists, atheists, agnostics, Hindus have asked me over the years, where in the Gospels does Jesus say that he's God and you should worship him? Where does it even say that? And Muslims in particular will say, if you show me where Jesus says, I am God, worship me, those exact words, I'll become a Christian. It doesn't even say that. So of course, someone doesn't have to say, I am God, worship me, in those exact words in order to be claiming something. But I do think it's really critical that we know where and how Jesus claimed deity, because in our 21st century context, it's not always necessarily that obvious. And so an excellent book I recommend on this topic is called Putting Jesus in His Place by Ed Komaszewski and Robert Bowman Jr. They use the acronym HANDS to make a case for Jesus' deity by showing that Jesus claimed deity through the honors he accepted, the attributes he claimed to possess, the names that he used for himself, the deeds that he performed, and the seat that he gave himself, which is the seat of God. It's an excellent book, and we also share several of these examples in the Islam Foundations course. In addition to Jesus' own words and actions, we also are informed by the response of his contemporaries to the things he says and does. His disciples responded to his deeds and words by worshiping him, and he accepted that, he allowed that. Whereas there are angels throughout the Bible who say, don't worship me, I'm not God. And there were apostles like Peter, who insisted immediately, do not worship me. I'm not God. In contrast, Jesus accepted and welcomed people's worship because it was appropriate. Also, the religious and political leaders of the time picked up stones to kill him. They charged him with blasphemy, and they ultimately had him crucified because of his words and deeds, which they clearly understood as him claiming deity. You could not be crucified or charged with blasphemy for claiming to be the Messiah. There were two ways that you could be charged with blasphemy. That was for speaking the personal name of God, Yahweh, or for claiming attributes of God. And that's what they believed Jesus to be doing. And he, in fact, was. So 3 of my favorite passages, I think it's important to be able to point to 1, 2, 3 passages at a moment's notice. And I don't have time to go through them all right now, but Mark 2, Mark 14, and Matthew 14 are 3 passages where just in a very brief account, we see Jesus claiming most, if not all of these means of claiming deity: honors, attributes, names, deeds, and the seat of God. So again, if you're interested in more of that, I'd recommend either the book or the Islam Foundations course. The 4th objection that I'm going to share tonight that Muslims raise is that Jesus was not crucified or killed. This comes up all the time with my Muslim friends. The objection comes from the Quran, again, chapter 4, verse 157. And again, there are standard Christian responses that I think are excellent, that I think every Christian should know. But there's also an argument that I would encourage people to know when communicating with Muslims in particular. So standard Christian responses include the unanimous historical evidence that Jesus was crucified by people who were writing in the 1st century, in the 2nd century. We have documentation from Christians as well as non-Christians, from Jews and Gentiles. And even today, it's virtually unanimous among scholars of all worldviews that Jesus was crucified and killed under Pontius Pilate. And that includes people whose stated purpose is to turn people away from Christianity. But by claiming that he was not crucified is not the way that anybody outside of Muslims is going to approach this objection to Jesus as God, because the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. So I think it's important to know the evidence, to know a few examples of historians, people from the 1st and 2nd century who wrote that about Jesus' crucifixion. But at a minimum, we should know that the evidence is unanimous. There was no other claim about what happened to Jesus for the first several hundred years after his crucifixion. Everybody agreed he was killed by crucifixion. But the argument that I want to propose that you can use with Muslims is that to first of all clarify with them that they believe, and the Quran affirms, that Jesus was not crucified or killed, but Allah made it look like Jesus was crucified. So I would ask, is that what you believe? Is that accurate? Is that what Quran 4:157 says, or is that what you believe? And Muslims will usually affirm. There's a minority of Muslims who will say that he was put on the cross, he was nailed to the cross, and he passed out. So they believe the swoon theory, and I would respond differently to that. But for Muslims who say that Jesus was not crucified or killed, but Allah made it look like he was, the inevitable conclusion to that claim is that Allah must be the greatest deceiver ever to exist. And he is therefore responsible for Christianity and for the billions of souls lost as a result of Christianity. If you, my Muslim friend, are claiming that Allah made it look like Jesus was crucified when he really wasn't, he is the greatest deceiver of all time. He is the reason people are going to hell. He is responsible for that. And then beyond that, there's no explanation whatsoever for why 600 years later, he would suddenly send down the truth in the Quran. This also, this theory that's put forth in the Quran, that Allah made it look like Jesus was crucified when it was really somebody else. They'll often say, well, it was really Judas, but God made him look like Jesus. Or it was really Simon of Cyrene, but Allah changed his face so that he looked like Jesus. This theory, this belief that's put forth in the Quran also leads to the conclusion that Jesus was either ignorant about Allah's deceit, or he knew about it and he failed to warn his followers, which makes him utterly incompetent as a Messiah. Or he could have been in on it and be just as deceitful. So Muslims think very highly of Jesus. They think he was a great prophet. He's to be utterly respected as a prophet, not as deity. And this belief put forth in the Quran results in the inevitable conclusion that Allah is a great deceiver and Jesus is a completely incompetent Messiah who's either totally ignorant or in on the deceit or just failed to communicate the truth to people. There's really no great conclusion to come to if you believe that Allah made it look like Jesus was crucified to everybody who was there. Objection number 5, Jesus didn't rise from the dead. This comes from the belief that Jesus wasn't crucified or killed in the first place, so he couldn't have risen from the dead. And the response here, one of the main reasons I include this here in the top 6 objections is not only because Muslims don't believe Jesus rose from the dead, but also because this argument, the minimal facts argument that has been advocated by Gary Habermas and Michael Licona is something that every Christian needs to know. So one way of remembering this argument is by using the acronym CASE, C-A-S-E. And basically what the argument is that there are dozens upon dozens of facts that virtually all scholars of all worldviews agree occurred. There are many of them. They agree that women were the first to find the empty tomb. They agree on a whole bunch of facts. But there are 13 that I go over in the Islam Foundations course, but there are really 4 that we can memorize and ought to memorize to be able to make a case when we have someone's attention for 4 minutes on an airplane or, in line somewhere or whatever. I think this is the single best argument for Christianity. There are other arguments I would encourage people to make for theism, but for Christianity overall, I think this argument is critical and essential, and singularly helpful. So, crucifixion. One of the facts that virtually all scholars of all worldviews agree on is that Jesus was crucified, and that's how he died. Secondly, the A in CASE is appearances. Virtually every scholar of every worldview believes that the disciples thought they saw the risen Jesus appear to them. Now, of course, atheists and agnostics will say Jesus didn't really appear to them, but they believed Jesus appeared to them, risen from the dead. That's what they agree on. And that is actually giving us a whole lot. It's giving us a lot more than I think a lot of atheists realize. Another agreed upon fact by scholars of all worldviews is that that skeptics who believe they saw the risen Christ became Christians. So one example of this is the Apostle Paul. So Saul of Tarsus believed he saw the risen Christ and became a follower of Jesus. James, the brother of Jesus, was a skeptic at best, believed he saw the risen Jesus and became a Christian. And then the fourth fact that most scholars of all worldviews believe in, this is more like 75%, whereas the others are like 95%, is that the tomb was actually empty. It was known where Jesus was buried. And when people went back on the third day after he was crucified, the tomb was empty. So just taking the information that virtually everybody of every worldview who has actually studied the information, who is a scholar on these events in this time period, agrees on, we can ask the question, what is the most reasonable explanation for these facts? I have shared this with some of the most well-informed, well-read, and studied agnostics and atheists in the world. And the best answer that I get from them when I ask them, what do you think happened? What do you think is happened that resulted in Christianity growing rapidly and all these people believing that Jesus was deity? And the answer that I get from the most well-informed non-Christians in the world is something happened. And I think that's funny, but it's also really informative, because there is no viable naturalistic theory that exists today to explain the facts that are agreed upon. The only reasonable explanation we have is a supernatural one. And the only problem with a supernatural explanation is that it requires a miracle. But the fact that anything exists, the universe exists rather than nothing existing, is also requires a miracle. Whether you believe that something resulted from someone or something resulted from no one. The fact that we're all here, that the universe exists in all its intricacy and the power that was necessary for that, the intelligence that was necessary for that, requires some sort of miracle from everybody. So there are naturalistic theories that have been debunked over the years, like the mass hallucination theory. Jesus had a twin. Jesus didn't really die on the cross, things like this. So I do talk in the Islam Foundations course about the problems with those theories, because sometimes people do bring those up if they're not scholars. But the scholars know that these have all been debunked. They're ridiculous theories, and there is no good naturalistic theory to explain what happened 2,000 years ago. And then sixth and finally, a very common objection that Muslims will frequently raise, and this might actually be the second or third most common objection that I hear from Muslims, is that the Trinity is inherently self-contradictory, it's illogical, it's incoherent, conceptually, it just makes no sense. And this objection is really based on a misunderstanding of the Trinity, and possibly a misunderstanding of a contradiction. The Trinity is actually logical and coherent. It's just complex and beyond our experience as humans. Because for humans, our experience is that for every one being, there's one person. What I am is a human. Who I am is Laura. but for every one human being, there's one person. For every one what, there is one who, when it comes to humanity. But what we have with God is that there is one God who exists as three persons. It's not a contradiction, because we don't believe in one God and three gods. We also don't believe in one person, that God is one person and three persons. Each of those would obviously be a contradiction. But we believe in one God who exists as three persons. And because a God is not a person, this is not a contradiction. So that is one way to respond. There's also a long and fascinating history of Tawhid, which is the parallel doctrine to the Trinity that Muslims believe, that is very interesting. And again, we talk about that in the Islam Foundations course, but it has a lot of problems of its own, which the Trinity actually solves. For example, Tawhid fails to explain how God could be the absolute singularity that has existed for all eternity, and yet also the Word of God, which they believe is the Quran, has existed for all eternity. They have no way of explaining how it is that God alone existed for all eternity past, and also the Quran existed for all eternity past. And yet there's an absolute singularity that existed for eternity past. This is a problem. The Trinity explains this. God and his Word and his Spirit as one being in three persons has existed for eternity past. The Trinity affirms the relational nature of God, which is a beautiful and glorious thing. It explains how God can be himself without being dependent on humans. And the Trinity shows that we glorify God when we display unity in diversity, using our different roles, different gifts, our uniqueness to work together in unity toward God's purposes. Tawhid, in contrast, is representative of the teaching in Islam that unity is accomplished by eliminating all diversity. So I would argue that the Trinity is not only very logical and coherent, though very complex, and beyond our ability to fully grasp, certainly, but it is also beautiful and shows some of the beauty of God's nature, whereas Tawhid runs into all kinds of problems and shows some of the problems with Islam. So an excellent book that I recommend to everybody is No God But One by Nabil Qureshi. This Nabil has a chapter in there on the Trinity. I think it's one chapter. It might be a few different chapters, but he does a phenomenal job with the Trinity in that book. The whole book is excellent, but even if you just read the chapter on the Trinity, I think it's worth reading. It's very interesting. So again, if you happen to be interested in the Islam Foundations course, check it out at womeninapologetics.com. This is the exact URL, which I think I said I would put in the chat. So I should do that. And that is all that I had planned to say. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer those, and maybe I will figure out how to stop sharing screen or something like that. I'm like technologically brilliant.
I think it's usually somewhere at the top.
Yeah, it's usually like right in front of me and really obvious. I don't know why I can't find it right now. Let's see. So
it's like, I think it says stop sharing screen or something.
Yeah.
Like a green, it should be like green colored.
Yeah, let's see. How do I expand this box?
Let me see if I can.
Oh, cool.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so let's see. I still don't see the stop sharing screen option for some reason. Maybe if I, yeah, I don't know why that is.
Is there anything at the top of your screen that's green? I forget what it looks like.
There isn't. Let's see. Maybe if I hide that. I see the grid video with everybody's picture.
Does anybody know how to like stop sharing screen? Any tech people out there?
Know that it's usually so obvious. It's at the top.
It should be right. Yeah, it should be right at the top at a little like green bar.
Yeah.
If you move your mouse the whole way to the top, it might have just disappeared. Like move your mouse the whole way to the top and it should like drop down if it's not visible there.
Yeah,
Jane,
I'm not.
You should also have access to it as host.
Oh, that's a good thought.
So I have
yeah. Usually I can't get rid of that silly bar at the top. And now I can't find the silly bar at the top when I want it.
No, right?
Let's see.
Since I only see your desktop, is your Zoom application, bring your Zoom application to the front.
Oh, there we go. Let's see. Now I see.
I'm trying to like stop it too, but let's see here.
Meeting controls.
Advanced sharing.
Yes, come up here, meeting controls. I want you up here. Let's see.
Maybe if I request remote control, does anything pop up on your screen?
I don't see it. Oh, wait, here. Okay, where'd it go? Maybe I'm going to see if, oh, good. Okay, I just turned on my my other monitor and now I see what I've been looking, like all of what I've been looking for. Stop share. There we go. It was on the other screen. I told you I'm absolutely technologically brilliant. So brilliant I can mess up technology that nobody else can.
All right, now we can go to questions.
Yay! All right, very good. Thanks for your patience, guys. So yeah, does anybody have any questions?
You just unmute yourself if you have a question.
Yeah, I actually have a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
So I'm actually meeting up with a Muslim tomorrow. Cool. And I've only met him a couple times. Now I was wondering if you would recommend how long should I get to know him before I start to bring up like the arguments for Christianity? Yeah,
that's a great question. Do you know anything about his background? Is he was he like born and raised in the US, or is he from another country originally?
He's from Pakistan.
Okay, cool. So I will tell you that in my experience, usually I don't even have to bring up the topic of spiritual things or Christianity or Islam, because my Muslim friends will almost always bring it up fairly quickly if I just show some sort of interest in them. But if you see a natural opportunity to bring it up without it seeming to be contrived, I would go ahead and bring it up and not be concerned at all. It's something that, like I said, Muslims are almost always very ready and excited to talk about. This is kind of a basic, if we're going to be friends, we absolutely need to have talked a little bit about religion and politics. Until then, it's just a completely superficial relationship. So I would say, yeah, if you see any sort of opening, go ahead and take it. Don't be reluctant about that. But you may also just pray that he would bring it up. That makes it really easy. And that's been the case almost every, in almost every relationship that I've had. So.
Awesome. Thank you. That's so helpful. And like the presentation was so good. I took notes and I have to get going now, but thank you so much. Like, I feel like God opened up that hour for me to watch this.
That's awesome. I love hearing that. Very good. Cool. Thank you.
Okay, so about the dilemma that you presented, I've heard that once before. Mm-hmm. And I've always wondered, since you've probably had more exposure to conversations, what maybe like the common, less scholastic Muslim might respond, and what the more learned or studied scholar might say in response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. So I can tell you what I actually don't know how, well, what I've heard from scholars is usually, the Quran the Quran says that the Gospels have been corrupted. So those verses abrogate any verses that affirm the Gospels. The problem with this is that there is not a single verse in the Quran that says the Gospels have been corrupted irretrievably or anything like that. There are several verses that Muslims will point to and say, see, look, this says the Gospels were corrupted. But if you just read them, you'll see that these verses that Muslims point to, even scholars, are actually claiming that the Gospels were misused, they were misunderstood, they were abused in much the same way that the scriptures are misused and misunderstood and abused today. There's not a single verse that actually says that the Gospels have been forever lost. So scholars generally just do not want to engage in that conversation with people. What I find is people on the scholarly side of things just changing the subject, refusing to engage, and that sort of thing. The average Muslim who is not a scholar has no idea how to respond beyond what I just said either. And they will, so I'll tell you my favorite response was, I was friends with a Muslim girl. I'm still friends with her, a Muslim woman from Libya. She's a doctor. She's very well read, very informed. And she was just coming at me about how the Gospels have been changed. And so I responded with this. And as she listened to it, she asked a few questions, and I, explained and clarified and such. And when she understood what I was saying, her response was, she goes, Laura, you are making me sweat. Do not talk about these things anymore. And it was funny because she was the one who was coming at me with these, the Gospels have been corrupted. They're so messed up. You can't trust them. And now all of a sudden her response is, I don't want to talk about these things with you anymore. And then of course, it was 24 hours later before she wanted to talk about spiritual things again, but not that thing. She didn't want to talk about that anymore, but she did. But I asked if we could, and eventually she said she didn't want to talk about any spiritual things anymore with me because she just didn't know the answers. She was used to Christians having no response whatsoever. And when I had responses, she was just shocked and didn't want to talk about spiritual things anymore. So I proposed that we go together and talk to her imam at her mosque about these things. And so that led to some other really, really interesting conversations. But the bottom line is he didn't have any good answers either. So he just kind of talked in circles and was like, oh, the hadith, the scholars believe that the Gospels have been corrupted. And I would say, well, what are they basing that on? they're basing it on the Quran. And I'm like, well, the Quran says this. And they're like, yeah, well, the imam would say, well, the scholars say this. I'm like, well, so we were talking in circles, like the scholars say this, but it's based on the Quran says this, yeah, and kind of getting nowhere. So let's see. So yeah, I have not heard anybody give any sort of decent or reasonable response to this argument. I'm kind of looking forward to the day that they do, but in the meantime, then that's part of the reason why I think it's so effective, is I've heard no decent response whatsoever. So I don't know if this is a comment on what we're talking about now, so I'll just read this just in case it is. If I remember correctly, Muhammad also specifically taught that Christians and Jews were to judge his message against the text of their scriptures. Yes, which would make preservation of the message necessary. Yes, that's exactly right. Yes, yep, that's exactly right. Muhammad specifically said that if you have the Gospels or the Torah, you're supposed to judge according to them, obey them, stand firm upon them, judge everything according to them. And so, and that was in the 7th century. And again, our texts are based on on manuscripts from the 3rd and 4th centuries, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. So it's a big problem for Islam. And generally Muslims, when they hear this argument, the response is to no longer be willing to engage on this topic. But I do think that at a minimum, it puts an end to this myth that is so widespread that you can just tell a Christian their Gospels have been changed and you win the argument, and they'll become Muslims, or they'll have nothing to say because they know it's true that the Gospels have been changed. If we can get past that, I think then we can finally start to have some real discussions about evidence and reasoning, or at least about something else, because in my experience, Muslims are going to hammer that home until you have a response.
So I have a question. Sorry, I'm driving home from work, so you can probably only see my picture.
Yeah, no problem.
But I'm really excited about this, and I've already registered for the summer course. I'm super excited about it.
Oh, outstanding.
I think it's really important to say that while I'm a Christian and I'm super passionate about the Lord, I'm married to an Afghan.
Okay.
So I'm debating with people all the time. And I just wanted to ask if you've had any conversations with Muslims about the concept of atonement, and if you have, what that's been like. Because what I find is, because sacrifice is still a part of their tradition, so many people don't really understand the concept of atonement. And I know that there's pushback on Abraham and Isaac, the whole idea that it was Ishmael that Abraham was going to sacrifice versus Isaac, and breaking it down to prophecy and basically helping them understand what atonement means has been a big aha. So I'm just curious if you've had that experience, if you've discussed atonement with many of the people you've debated with.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've had that conversation a few times, and a common response has been to something that is also found in the Quran, which is that Muslims will kind of paraphrase it and say, well, nobody can carry the burdens of another person. Nobody can atone for the burdens of somebody else. But what the Quran verse actually says is that nobody who has their own burdens to bear can bear the burdens of another. And so if we can point out, by using their sources that they trust, that someone who doesn't have their own sin to bear may be able to bear the sins or the burdens of another, then we can show that the Quran does not disqualify the possibility of Jesus atoning for our sins if we even if you believe the Quran, even if you trust that verse, as long as Jesus was sinless, which is what we do believe. I haven't necessarily. I do think that this has been a huge factor in the Muslims I know who have become Christians, seeing the beauty of the message. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Some of my friends who have become Christians will often point to Jesus, laying down his life for our sins as something just glorious and beautiful and beyond glorious that they want to be a part of, they want for themselves. So, so I guess those are a few thoughts about the idea of atonement and the role that it plays. I do think that's a great point to bring up, and that the most common response is, well, nobody can bear another's burdens, which actually, I mean, is untrue even in our fallen world. That we have all kinds of examples of people bearing one another's burdens. I mean, and even parents co-signing for their children's loans and things like that, and they end up having to pay if the children can't pay their own debts. So there are practical examples that happen all the time. It just makes no sense, in my opinion, to say that someone can't, that a bearer of burdens cannot bear the burdens of another. But the atonement is something that I've found either can have a really big impact. So yeah, great question.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I have one more that I think is important to bring up.
Yeah, go for it. That's great.
I have so many, but another one that I wanted to ask you is, I've actually been in a room with several people who are Muslim who have begun their own debate about the fact that the Quran says that Jesus is the Messiah, where one person will say it does say that, and another one freaks out and says absolutely not. And then it turns into a huge debate between them. Have you experienced that, where people say that that is? And while I can say that I'm still in a place where I'm deeply studying the chronology, the authorship, just in our scripture, I haven't really read the Quran. I've gotten into El-Tabari a little bit just to prove the point of scripture.
Right.
But I haven't actually read the Quran, and I was just curious if you've had that experience.
Yeah, so I have not actually seen Muslims debate one another on that topic, although that's that's interesting, and that would be really entertaining. But all of the interactions that I've had that I can recall, in all of those interactions, Muslims have been very quick to tell me that Jesus was the Messiah. They affirm that. I can't think of an instance where a Muslim said, no, he was not the Messiah. But when I ask, well, what does that mean? The response is usually, what do you mean? They don't really know what it means to be the Messiah. And so they'll say, well, it was like a title of honor that Jesus had. It means like he was, he was a great prophet who was expected to come. He was like an extraordinary miracle worker, or just plain, I don't know. He was Messiah. It's just like a title. So I have seen disagreement and confusion about what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. And sometimes Muslims will say, what do you think it means? And then I'll explain that to them. And I remember one person in particular going, well, I'm not sure what it means, but it doesn't mean that. So yeah, there certainly is a lot of confusion for Muslims surrounding what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. But that would be really entertaining, I think, to watch Muslims disagree about whether or not he even was the Messiah. But yes, the Quran most certainly does say that Jesus was the Messiah.
That he will return and actually everyone will worship him. That was the subject of it, was that he is going to return and that everyone will convert and worship Jesus. That was the debate. So it was about his return. So I just wanted to specify that. But
okay, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, excellent.
Anyone else? Quiet crowd. Well, if there's no more questions, I guess we could just thank Laura for her lovely presentation. And you guys should all take her course. Go to the Women Apologetics website, sign up, and yeah, $25.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's great to be with you all. And I hope to join you again sometime in the future.
Great. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you all.
Stop.